Hello and welcome to the Jorge Luis Borges presentation for Chicano Hispanic Latina literature. This is the voice of Brian McShane, pretending he's a radio DJ. Okay, up front here is a table of contents. I find it useful to front load the presentation with the order we're going to try to stick to, both to keep myself on task and so you know when I'm about to stop talking. Biography. Quick note on the edition I used and the translation and why that's important. A brief to keep in mind announcement. We'll do two stories, the Babylon Lottery and the Library of Babel. We'll try to connect the two at the end, and then there's going to be sort of a think about magical realism, which was one of the movements we did in class, and I know one of the other presentations is going to be about Marquez, who's kind of the poster author sounds bad, kind of at the forefront of this movement, and if you like Marquez, you're gonna like this. I found it kind of exciting. So, the biographical information. Borges was born 8/24/1899. He died 6/14/1986. He was raised in what was described as a then shabby Palermo district in Buenos Aires. His family was important to both the history of Argentina as well as he had a British ancestry, and he was reported to have learned English before he learned Spanish. He read widely, spoke many languages. He was reported to have read, the first books it was reported he read were The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The 1001 Nights, Don Quixote, and what was called the novels of H.G. Wells, so likely War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and so on. During World War I, Borges was in Geneva with his family, Geneva being in Switzerland, and he was learning French and German there. So add that to the list of languages that he could speak. He returned to Buenos Aires in 1921 after the war was over. He started writing essays and poems, publishing essays and poems before overcoming what Britannica called his shyness and started to write fiction in earnest. The books I drew from is called Fictions. It was collected in 1944 and revised in 1956. Perhaps interesting to note is the collection took place the year before World War II ended. So there's kind of I know the world wars typically denote big literary movements, and him having spanned both of them is kind of important. But that's, of course, dependent on your particular school that you adhere to for criticism. Anyway, this is the book that I used. This is the ISBN number. It's a picture from the cover. The supplied copies of the stories that I used for the class that I emailed you were different translations. Even the titles are different. So if my quotes don't adhere to what you've read, but they sound kind of the same, that's why. This is a different translation. I did find in kind of looking around that this Giovanni character was reported to have been the best translator, but all his stuff is out of print, and all the new editions are widely heralded as being kind of bad by comparison. But I guess we take what we can get. The science fiction public service announcement. This is from an article by this J. Andrew Brown. It says, Borges has often been cited in arguments for the significance of science fiction, though his precise place in science fiction has been the subject of some debate. Leonard Cheever admits that, quote, the place of Jorge Luis Borges in the world of science fiction is, to say the least, somewhat ambiguous, end quote, but goes on to argue that, quote, science fiction is primarily a literature of ideas rather than merely of icons, and thus I choose to read Borges as a science fiction writer, end quote. The reason I want to front load the presentation with this information before we talk about a particular story of the two we're going to do is because maybe not science fiction, but this is speculative fiction. This sort of elements, the sort of otherworldly elements of the things. It might fit more with a Hawthorne interpretation of science fiction. If you take something like John Goodman Brown, you're taking a society, an aspect of society, and blowing it up to be so absurd as to be a mirror of society. So maybe keep that idea in mind as we talk about this stuff. Now, the Babylon Lottery. That's a bad picture of a scratch-off I took on my phone, so if that's not totally clear, that's what that is supposed to be. As for summary, it's about a lottery. It starts out as a lottery related by the narrator's father. It's much like we'd imagine it. You bought a ticket from a barber, and this is probably dealing with barbers of old, where barbers were surgeons, barbers did bloodletting, so barbers being someone you just got your hair cut from is probably not what they mean here. But again, given the translation difficulties, it could mean any number of things. You bought bits of bone, you bought decorated parchment with copper coins. A drawing was held in the middle of the day, and the winner received silver coins. So you paid for a ticket, and if you won, you got more valuable versions of the coins you used to buy your ticket. What happened then here in this society is that the lottery started to change when it was reported to have failed. It failed because it lacked moral virtue, since it only appealed to a sense of hope. The first change was introduced a fine. You had a 1 in 30 chance of having to pay something extraordinary instead of winning a bigger sum of money. The danger increased the participation, and those who didn't play were looked down on, as well as the losers. So there was the people who won, who were heralded and were obviously very happy because they won the lottery. There were the people who lost, who were, looked down on as losers, and there were the people who didn't play, who were reviled by the society. This is perhaps the clearest, if you've seen the title, The Babylon Lottery, and maybe thought about the Shirley Jackson short story, The Lottery, this is the clearest connection between the two. This is a society who begins to place such an importance on the lottery that not playing it becomes less and less an option. The danger, according to the story, increased participation, and it led to the rise of something called the company, who purportedly ran the lottery, although that is never outright stated. It's just readily inferred that the company runs the lottery. Fines paid by the losers went to fund the winners, so the losers who couldn't or wouldn't pay were initially jailed and incurred more fines. Another change to the lottery came to eliminate money entirely, and it became almost solely about being jailed. That made it even more popular. And this is a quote here: "The company found itself forced to increase its adverse numbers," end quote. This means the company found that the more people lost the lottery, the better the lottery did, so make more losers. In another form of the evolution of this lottery, its kind of ultimate form, it took place every 70 days. And your fate on the lottery became your fate for the next 70 days. Whatever lot you pulled, if you're in jail for 70 days until you can maybe get out with the next drawing. If you became a very rich man or woman or child as a result of this lottery, you could lose all that at the next drawing. Life became a series of drawings for these people. And as the lottery changed over time, the company running it was elevated to higher and higher power. An interesting sort of why the lottery is more than the lottery. This is a rather long quote here from the, oh no, it's not. The narrator explains that the drawing leads to a sentence. Another set of drawings must take place to settle on the executioner. All right, here's a clearer way to do this. This is the ultimate, the last iteration of the lottery. I play the lottery and I lose. Another lottery has to decide my fate. That lottery may decide that I'm going to be sentenced to death. Then another drawing has to take place to decide who's going to be the executioner. Then another lottery has to take place to find out if I get to know who the executioner is. Another lottery has to take place to find out if the executioner, what methods are they going to use to execute me. Another lottery might take place to find out if instead of being executed, I'm going to be given a big sack of gold. And this is the quote: "The number of drawings is infinite. No decision is final. All diverge into others," end quote. This to me is the clearest example of how the lottery is a metaphor. It's not about a drawing so much as a worldview in which everything is the outcome of a drawing, or to take that a step further, everything is chance. Everything is chaos, everything is chance, everything is an arbitrary whim of some other decider, to quote a former president. This company may or may not even exist. Let me see if I can find this. The company, here's some definitions of the company from the book. Quote, "There is nothing so contaminated with fiction as the history of the company." End quote. The company was described as having divine modesty. The theories about the company include the following. One, the company, this is a quote, "The company is eternal and that it will last until the last night of the world when the last god annihilates the cosmos." End quote. Another is, quote, "The company is omnipotent," end quote, "but will only affect insignificant details." And then the final supposition about the company is, quote, "The company has never existed and never will," end quote. So by way of characters, we've got two. We've got the company, which we've decided here we don't know what this is, and then we have the narrator. The narrator appears to be perhaps some type of pagan, some type of wizard. Wizard is used in the translation I have, but not in reference to the narrator himself. He's the one telling the reader basically about the lottery, its evolution. He has been marked with a tattoo of Beth. He refers to it as a number that makes it Hebrew. It's a Hebrew number. I think it's 2. It gives him power at certain phases of the moon, over others with different marks. He has described himself as, quote, "severed the jugular vein of sacred bulls against a black rock," end quote. So he's been involved in almost perhaps some type of Lovecraftian, black magic, who knows. He's been invisible. He claims to have these magic powers. Among these powers, he's managed to stay alive, which is something that warrants note due to the history of the lottery. As far as interpreting this, I said before it was a bit of a metaphor. I mean, the lottery is not a lottery. The lottery is a way of looking at the world. I don't want to get too much further into that till we do the next story. I have a quote here from Ilan Stevans. Borges in the Future is the name of the article. He says one gets the impression that science and art are incompatible for Borges. He calls it axiomatic, that nowhere in his stories is there found a comment on modern technology or scientific discoveries. I'm including this quote because I flat out disagree with it. The narrator describes the lottery's process as elemental, and he talks about the conversion of copper into bone or copper into slips of paper, and then those slips of paper into silver, read to me like a discussion about alchemy. So I do kind of think saying he had no place for science or anything, and the entire evolution of a system, this is a probability, this is numbers, this is chance, this is math, essentially. So I included an article solely to disagree with it. We discussed the company being the other character who may or may not exist. The opening description of the narrator is that he's been everything. He's been rich, he's been poor, he's been free, he's been in jail. He's been all these things, and we can assume this is due to his role in the lottery. But then there's this quote here. It says, "I have little time left to tell what I know. We have been warned that the ship is ready to sail." So here the narrator, the only character besides this nebulous company, is about to flee. He's perhaps just lost the lottery. If you wanted to take a class, a religious interpretation of this, there's note that the clergy was at the forefront in trying to incorporate the poor who couldn't play the lottery, and they wanted to include it so everybody could participate. This comes after the note about money being almost wholly removed, so that's a bit odd, maybe worth exploring. It's as if to say the church only cared about the poor when they didn't stand to benefit economically. It's maybe then less a religious argument and more a economic, more a Marxist critique of it, though the eventual inclusion of everybody led to the rise of the company and led to this, arguably, this superstructure to rise in power. So if you wanted to include class and religion, you kind of have to include economics. That everything was an outcome of the lottery. I want to end this part here with this quote. The lottery is, quote, a paleographic document unearthed in the temple, may well be the work of yesterday's drawing or that of one lasting a century. No book is ever published without some variant in each copy. Scribes take a secret oath to omit, interpolate, and vary, end quote. So to kind of come full circle about the lottery being a metaphor here, everything is being attributed to the outcome of one particular lottery. This book it talks about, this document unearthed in a temple, could have been put there as a result of one drawing. The lottery's held that says, put this book in this temple, and then somebody finds it. Or a million lotteries led up to the decision that that book ended up in that temple. So the whole world, insofar as it exists, is a lottery. The lottery has changed over time. The narrator has presumably been playing and is now fleeing from what, according to the title, would be Babylon. However, place matters a little less. And now we're going to talk about briefly the Library of Babel. By way of summary, this story chronicles a library. It's an outright metaphor. It's stated in the beginning. Let me see if I can find that first line. The opening line of the translation I have is, quote, the universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite, perhaps an infinite number of hexagonal galleries with enormous ventilation shafts in the middle encircled by very low railings, end quote. So it tells you right out of the bat that the universe is the library, and then for the rest of the story, library is used and universe doesn't come up again. However, universe equals library. Inside the library, there are two rooms that are not the same as all these rooms of library shelves. One offers standing room for sleeping, and the other is a bathroom. The only thing in here besides books is a mirror, which unnamed people in this story use to explain that maybe the library is not in fact infinite, because why would you need a mirror to double the illusion of space if the space is without end? The narrator does not believe this to be the case. There are lamps that are referred to as spherical fruits, and there are two of them. They emit what is called insufficient light, and the narrator laments having traversed this library since his youth, and there's the line, my eyes can scarcely decipher what I write. This line leads me to believe that the narrator is blind, or becoming blind. He's losing his sight. He spent his life looking for a specific book, and the final closing hope of the narrator is that someone immortal were to head in one direction long enough, they would find that everything would repeat itself. That's the hope that keeps the narrator alive, you could argue. And that's it. That's what the book is about, or the story is about. A library that goes on forever. When you start to talk about particulars, you start to see what this is perhaps about. For critical analysis rambling section of this, I found a website I'm going to link when I turn in all this stuff, and it says, this is a pretty long quote here, it could well be said that the Library of Babel is more relevant today than it was when Borges wrote it because of the advent of the internet. In this story, the man at the library makes a point of how any number of books destroyed by heretics is irrelevant in the greater scope of the library. Today, however, we have access to exponentially more information than ever before, information which can be useful or useless, accurate or inaccurate. How we perceive this information and what we do with it are choices with higher stakes than the destroyers of books in Borges' allegory. The notion that the universe is a total library, while daunting, can be a source of inspiration. All problems have a solution that exists somewhere waiting to be found. Of course, there's also numerous wrong solutions and problems and other problems to be had. Thus, we must be increasingly vigilant as we plunge further into the information age, end quote. I don't particularly agree with it, but it's worth keeping in mind that perhaps Borges was well ahead of his time technologically. Let's take this a little further back. I drew this picture here. You can see it. It's a circle with a hexagon in it. This is a quote from the book. "The library is a sphere whose consummate center is any hexagon and whose circumference is inaccessible," end quote. So these 5 lines that make up the hexagon would be the 5 bookshelves. The inaccessible circumference of the circle is the space in here. I don't know if you can see. Now it's me just moving the picture around. The space between the line and the end of the circle is the circumference that can't be accessed. It's a tower. It's a circular tower. It is the Tower of Babel. It's almost a retelling of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel from the book of Genesis with a different ending. To paraphrase the original, for those who don't know it, there was a time a long time ago where all human beings spoke the same language, and they used their communication skills to decide to make a tower that would reach up to heaven, and God decided this was not allowed to happen, smacked it down, and spread everybody around and made it so they couldn't understand each other, and that's why there are so many languages on the earth. That's kind of an oversimplified version, but on a surface level, you could say this is a retelling of that story wherein the outcome is different. The library is called ab aeterno in the book, which I think is Latin. It means, according to dictionary.com, from an infinitely remote point of time in the past. So essentially, it's been around for a long time. The construction of the place is said to have only been possible by a god. And there's a legend in this fiction about the man of the book, which is said to be a cipher that would allow one person to understand all the different languages contained in these books. One librarian was said to have seen it, and it was the same as a god. This is the book which the narrator has presumably been searching for. Interesting to note here that it's always a god and never the god with a capital G, and that man appears, at least in my translation, capitalized. So it can be pretty clearly about man, capital M, man, overthrowing lowercase g God, which is one interpretation of what the Tower of Babel was meant to do. So if you want to adhere to that, it's a straight-up retelling of a Bible story. That it's about religion largely. There were official searchers of the library called inquisitors. The people that burned the books were called purifiers. This could lend to sort of Puritanism, sort of book burning, sort of witch trials. I mean, there's a million different directions you can run in here. If you want to take a symbolism kind of deconstruction way, here's a quote that'll blow your mind. There are 32 books per shelf. There are 410 pages per book, 40 lines per page, 80 letters per line, and every book on its spine has writing that has nothing to do with what is inside the book. What? You could deal with these numbers. There's 25 total characters. It's the 22 of the alphabet. It's the space counts as a symbol, the comma, and a period. So there's 25 total combinations. And if you're into sort of number analysis, that would be an effective way to go. For me, I like to look at it by language. One book was shown to what was called as a cipherer in the course of this, but this is a remote tale. This guy said it was Portuguese. Another person said the same book was Yiddish. And less than a century later, they discovered it was Lithuanian dialect of Guarani with Arabic inflections. This is kind of a long book, a quote from the book. "The symbol library admits of the correct definition ubiquitous and everlasting system of hexagonal galleries, but library is bread or pyramid or anything else, and the 7 words which define it possess another value. You who read me, are you sure you understand my language?" This to me tells me what the story is about. Instead of just being the narrator telling the reader about the existence of a library, the word library, according to this quote, is a symbol, the symbol library. You see the word written library and you think of a library, and in the course of this story you're going to think library as has been described to you, an everlasting system of hexagonal galleries. It's possible in another language the same symbol library means bread, the same symbol means pyramid, the same symbol means canary. So it's possible that even during the course of quote-unquote understanding this story, that you can't understand this story. Perhaps a major complaint of this work, and also the other work, is that there's a lack of conflict, a lack of characters. Basically, there's a narrator telling the reader something, and one is supposed to take the word of some nameless person who's living a situation that's totally unbelievable. But I'd like you to think about this. If there's never a discussion of people leaving the library, and the interactions with people outside the library is something that literally never comes up, the fact that there are no other real people in either the lottery story or the library story other than the narrator and the reader of the story, where is the reader? To stick with the library for a second, if we're getting this story from the half-blind or totally blind narrator of the Library of Babel, how did we get this story in our hands? How are we reading it if we're not there with him? So that kind of expands these philosophical interpretation of Borges that can drive you crazy if you're not careful. You know, if the library is a metaphor for the universe the same way the lottery was a metaphor for the workings of the universe, then every book in the library, however different, is another person. Maybe every book is a person, and that's the symbol. Let's go over here and wrap this. Connections for the two. Both stories are similar in theme. They contain stated and sweeping metaphors for, I'd argue, the universe. Actually, one of them, it states it. The other one I've kind of inferred. The narrator is the main character or the sole character. In the library story, there's discussion of other people, but no real interaction. There's no reason to believe the narrator isn't just lying to us. In both cases, it's very possible that the narrator is the only character. Both contain nebulous organizations or stories of it that may or may not exist. The company in the lottery and the inquisitors, the book burners, the other people looking for books in both stories have, you know, sort of a monolithic nebulous organization. This could be organized religion, this could be society, this could be other countries, this could be all manner of things. Both stories contain overt and covert metaphors and symbols. Stated right in the beginning, the universe is a library. The universe is a lottery. And then, you know, if the library is made up of books, what do the books symbolize? If the books contain characters, what do the characters symbolize? And on backwards, which is why reading this can keep you up if you're not too careful. And the relationship with the reader is important. To make a Marquez connection real quick before we do the magical realism bit, is Marquez subtitles some of his short stories A Tale for Children. The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World, I believe, is one, and I think A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings is another one. They're parables. They're meant to teach you something. This, I'd argue, is similar. You're meant to take away from these stories some relationship between the metaphor and your own life, but that's a little more maybe subjective. Magical realism. There's this article I'm going to post the stable URL to by this Seymour Menton, who makes a case, a pretty compelling one, that Borges is a writer of magical realism in the sense of, we read Marquez. Did we read? No, we didn't. Uria, the paintbrush. They